Thank you, Pete, for your very kind and generous introduction. The title of my talk is Hayek, the Nobel, and the Revival of Austrian Economics. This topic clearly calls for a long-run history of thought perspective. It will turn out that the flow of ideas to which we will be referring consists of the development of profound yet elementary insights. But there is no need to apologize for the elementary character of the insights which we will be discussing. In fact, this paradox that the revival of the ideas of the Austrian school has consisted of insights at the same time profound and elementary will turn out to be crucially important for the chapter in the history of modern economic thought that we will be exploring. The orthodox view of the history of the Austrian School of Economics is as follows. The school was born in 1871 with the publication of Menger's Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre. The 143-year history of this school is usually seen as beginning with a 60-year steady growth in its importance and in its professional reputation, followed in the 1930s by a precipitous decline. That decline led to a 30-year period from about 1940 to about 1970, generally seen as the low point in its history. From the point of view of the mainstream of economic thought, during these decades, the Austrian school had virtually disappeared. The debates of the 30s, it was generally believed, had decisively defeated the Austrians, represented in most accounts by Ludwig Mises and Friedrich Hayek. They had been defeated in regard to macroeconomic issues, in which Keynes and the Keynesians were seen as having overwhelmed Hayek. They were seen as defeated in regard to the socialist calculation debate, in which Langer, Lerner, and others were seen to have thoroughly discredited Mises's bold, politically charged challenges to the profession. And they were seen as having been defeated in regard to the more abstract issues in capital theory, in which Frank Knight was seen to have conclusively bested Hayek's attempts to reaffirm the classic Austrian Böhm-Bawerkian positions long ago challenged by John Bates Clark. Moreover, the Austrians in that period were seen as having been hopelessly unable to keep up with modern methodological developments in the profession. Austrians were out of date in regard to the exciting advances in mathematical economics and in econometric research. Mises' insistence on the purely logical, a priori character of economic theory was seen as thoroughly out of step with a 20th century philosophy of science rooted in the empirical. To boot, the political unrest of the 1930s, which physically scattered the group of Austrian scholars who had surrounded Mises in Vienna, meant that the Austrian school existed for economists between 1940 and 1970 strictly as a bygone episode in the textbooks of the history of economic thought. This perception on the part of the wider economics profession that the Austrian school had, by the end of World War II, disappeared, was, curiously enough, reinforced by a sense somehow developed among key members of the Vienna group that a separate identity for the Austrian school was no longer needed. We can mention perhaps Gottfried Haberler and Fritz Machlup as being outstanding examples in this regard. It appears that these eminent Austrians and others honestly believed that what was importantly new in the Austrian economics developed between 1871 and 1930 had, by the end of World War II, in fact been successfully absorbed into the mainstream body of economic thought. To insist on a uniquely Austrian label was, from this point of view, professionally counterproductive and, in the worst sense of the term, backward-looking. The wider profession had fully embraced the once novel Austrian ideas on opportunity cost, on marginalist thinking, on the subjectivism needed for the analysis of the demand side of the market. To insist on a separate label seemed, to these Austrians, to insist on an unfruitful intellectual isolationism. A final nail in the coffin of the Austrian school was, in the view of mainstream economics, driven by what was seen as the utter unfashionability of its ideological implications as understood by the mainstream. In a post-war era in which socialist ideals were widely seen as shining pointers to a progressive future, in which the role of massive government planning and control was not to be questioned, in that era, Mises and Hayek's defense of free markets and classical liberalism was seen simply as antediluvian. To identify oneself as an Austrian was almost to place oneself outside the perimeter of modern civilized social discourse. With the Austrian school seen in this orthodox view as having simply died by mid-century, the resurgence of interest in the school, which began in the 1970s, can be seen as an intriguing, mystifying history of thought puzzle. What was responsible for this mysterious resurrection of an intellectual tradition long thought to be completely dead? I'll try and interpret the theme assigned for this keynote lecture as being to explore the possibility of dispelling this mystery by reference to the important 1970 award of the Nobel Prize in Economics to Friedrich Hayek. What role, if any, did the award of this prize play in the remarkable resurgence of Austrian economics during the past 4 decades? There can be no doubt that Hayek's receiving the Nobel Prize had an impact both on the way the profession looked at the Austrians and on the way in which the Austrians saw themselves. The mainstream view may indeed have viewed Hayek as having been roundly defeated during the 30s, but his stature as a most prominent economist was never in doubt. His earlier stellar pre-war reputation, burnished now by the award, meant that Hayek's ideas and those of his mentors must now be re-examined with at least a modicum of professional respect. Even Hayek's views on the ideological implications of his economics, views long vilified ever since Hayek's 1944 road to serfdom. Even those views could now receive a fresh examination, especially as the ideological climate had mellowed somewhat since the 40s. But Austrians themselves could also now see their own ideas from a less sheltered perspective. One eminent writer, himself by no means antagonistic to the ideas of Hayek and to some extent of Mises, described with a certain dismay the self-image adopted by followers of Mises during the years leading up to the 70s. Writing before Hayek's Nobel Prize, James Buchanan commented, "Mises and his followers have been too prone to accept the splendid isolation of arrogant eccentrics, to divorce their teaching too sharply from mainstream interests, and too eager to launch into polemic, epistemological, methodological, ideological." Now, one need not agree fully with this pronouncement in order to recognize its germ of truth. The handful of American Austrians had, during the immediate post-war decades, virtually written off the economics profession as hopeless. They had, in effect, retreated into a small circle surrounding Mises himself, protected against the alien ideas of the mainstream by a self-erected wall of ideological intellectual seclusion. Hayek's Nobel Prize cannot but have sparked among these Misesians the hope that perhaps the insights of Mises and Hayek can penetrate mainstream preconceptions after all. Moreover, The Nobel Prize awarded to Hayek came at a time when a certain flurry of fresh activity among American Austrians was being noticed. Several of Mises's disciples in the United States had made contributions which went beyond Mises's own published works. Murray Rothbard had in 1962 published his massive work, Man, Economy and State, seeking to restate the central Misesian themes. I myself had in 1966 published a little book attempting to clarify Misesian capital theory. I had also published in 1973 a book elaborating on Misesian entrepreneurial theory and linking that theory to Hayek's work recognizing the role of dynamic competition instead of the textbook concentration on the perfectly competitive model. In 1974, in fact, just months before the Nobel Award to Hayek, and soon after Mises's passing in 1973, a conference, often referred to as South Royalton, took place. And in that conference, for an entire week, a group of some 50 or so young people, identified by their earlier expressed potential interest in these ideas, heard lectures on Austrian themes delivered by Ludwig Lachmann, Murray Rothbard, and myself. The participation of Ludwig Lachmann, who held the chair of economics at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, was particularly important. A senior respected scholar who had studied and written under Hayek during the 30s, Lachmann introduced young Misesians to a perspective on Austrian economic thought which opened their eyes to the precise location of the battlefield of ideas in which subjectivists such as the Austrians must wrestle with mainstream orthodoxy. Several of the participants in the South Royalton Conference, notably Gerald de Driscoll and Mario Rizzo, were later to incorporate central elements of Lachmann's thinking into their own important contributions to the Austrian resurgence. So that, for American Austrians, the 1974 Nobel Award to Hayek did not occur, so to speak, in a vacuum. It certainly inspired them to deepen their understanding of Austrian ideas and to learn how to defend them against the standard mainstream rejection of these ideas. Not only did the award have the effect of bringing Hayek himself back into economics proper to some extent. I say this because Hayek's work during the 50s and 60s at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, not in its economics department, had led to the perception that Hayek's scholarly interests were no longer focused on economic theory. The award also had the effect, to a significant extent, of reawakening interest among younger American Austrians in Hayek's earlier work, as well as in the writings of Mises himself. An example of such reawakened interest is Gerald de Driscoll's important, unfortunately neglected work, Economics as a Coordination Problem, The Contributions of Friedrich A. Hayek, which he published in 1977. However, while we cannot deny all these sociological, quote, sociological implications of Hayek's Nobel Prize, we should not fall into the error of seeing the subsequent resurgence of interest into Austrian economics as adequately and fully explained by these implications. Our position in this lecture will be that a more important aspect of the resurgence consisted in purely doctrinal developments. Understanding these doctrinal developments will, in fact, open up for us a perspective on the history of Austrian economics which differs in decisive respects from the orthodox history which we have outlined earlier. Indeed, the revisionist history of the Austrian school that we shall propose goes far, as we shall see, to remove the mystery which we associated with the Austrian resurgence, so that the explanation for the Austrian resurgence turns out, as we shall see, not to depend primarily on the sociological implications of the Hayek Nobel Prize, but on doctrinal developments. The revisionist view of the history of the Austrian School of Economics, which we would wish to propose here, in this revisionist view, the perception that the vitality of the Austrian tradition in economic theory came to an end at about 1940 is categorically rejected. Quite to the contrary. This revisionist view maintains that the decade between 1937 and 1948 was marked by an outburst of activity, both on the part of Mises and, separately, on the part of Hayek, radically refining and enhancing the Austrian understanding of the market economy. In this revisionist view, we must accept the intriguing paradox that precisely at the time when the orthodox historical account saw the Austrian school as having died, precisely in that period, the leading economists in that school were making perhaps the most important theoretical contributions ever made during the entire span of the school's existence. In this revisionist view, the Austrian resurgence of the 70s and later decades consisted not in a mysterious resurrection of a long-dead tradition, but in the discovery by a new group of fresh younger scholars of the remarkable contributions made by Mises and by Hayek, discoveries that had been utterly overlooked by the mainstream historians of thought in their haste to bury what they viewed as an already completely dead intellectual movement. It must, of course, be conceded that this revisionist history of Austrian economics during the mid-century must grapple with some glaring difficulties. How could the important contributions which we claim for Mises and Hayek have been simply overlooked? The balance of this lecture will, by identifying these revolutionary contributions which we claim for Mises and Hayek, and by relating them both to the earlier versions of the Austrian economics and to contemporaneous developments in mainstream economics, this will attempt to deal with these obvious challenges. A good portion of my talk today will explore this claim that during the years between 1937 and 1948, Mises and Hayek made separate radical extensions of Austrian economics. We will here briefly identify these contributions in order to place our revisionist history of 20th century Austrian economics into its relevant context. At the same time, we will be able to address the obvious difficulties which we have referred to, confronting our revisionist view. The key to understanding all these issues is the well-known debate of the 1930s concerning the very possibility of rational central economic planning. As is well known, Mises had, early in the 20s, flatly declared rational central economic planning to be a contradiction in terms. Without genuine market prices for factors of production, Mises had pointed out, no central planning is possible. Without market prices, economic calculation in the complex society is impossible, period. Our thesis will be that the vigorous English language debates during the 1930s over this claim led Mises and Hayek separately to important clarifications. I emphasize clarifications, not modifications, but clarifications of their own earlier positions based on their Austrian understanding of markets. Our thesis will indeed be that these clarifications meant, in effect, that the subjectivist Austrian understanding of markets was being importantly refined, quite apart from the implications for the theory of socialism. It's true that from the short-run perspective of the socialist calculation debate, these refinements merely defended the earlier Austrian critique of socialism against the important challenges of such socialism defenders as H.D. Dickinson, Oscar Lange, Abba P. Lerner. But from the longer-run history of economic thought perspective, we can see that these refinements in their true light. From this longer range history of thought perspective, we can, at least in retrospect, see that these refinements radically deepened the Austrian understanding of the market process. The mainstream of economic thought during this period certainly did not appreciate these defenses of the Austrian positions in the socialist calculation debate, so that it is not surprising that they completely failed to recognize the radically important deepening of Austrian subjectivism, which these refinements of the Austrian arguments in the calculation debate constituted. What Mises and Hayek realized, or at least sensed, when confronted with the Lange-Lerner-type refutations, so-called refutations of the Austrian critiques of socialism, what they realized was that these refutations rested on a view of microeconomic theory which focused almost exclusively on equilibrium outcomes. That is, on outcomes in which rivalrous competitive entrepreneurial activity is entirely absent. Such equilibrium outcomes, these critics of Mises and Hayek maintained, these outcomes can in principle be simulated by central planners. What Mises and Hayek now sensed was that significant elements of basic economic understanding must be restated in a manner emphasizing not the optimality of competitive equilibrium states of affairs, but the social benefits derived from the systematic steps taken during the rivalrous market process, starting from disequilibrium conditions. Mises's claims concerning the impossibility of rational central planning grew out of his understanding the dynamic market process. Our position in today's talk, the position which nourishes what we've called the revisionist history of the Austrian school, is that the refinements which thus elaborated on the market process, on the theory of the market process, did indeed represent a radical historic advance in Austrian economics and a radical historic deepening of Austrian subjectivism. That the wider profession failed to see all this is and was responsible for the orthodox history of thought view that by 1940 the Austrian school had retreated to old-fashioned, sterile regurgitations of long-rejected neoclassical orthodoxy. A more sophisticated understanding of these refinements, on the other hand, enables us to recognize the vitality and creativity of the surviving Austrians, Mises and Hayek, precisely during the decade in which the standard view saw them as merely pathetic relics of an earlier, once important but now terminated tradition. In the more extended exposition during the rest of this talk, we will deal with the question of the extent to which Mises and Hayek were themselves fully aware of the radicality of their refinements. Let us restate the central theme of this talk. This theme is that the significant elements in the resurgence of Austrian economics, beginning with the 1970s, consisted in the discovery by younger Austrians of these radical revisions enunciated during the 1937-1948 decade. As illustrations of this claim, we draw attention to two books contributed during the 1975-85 decade by two leading members of this group of younger Austrians. One book we've already mentioned, that was Gerald Driscoll's Economics as a Coordination Problem, the 1977 book, which, among other themes, brilliantly analyzed Hayek's contributions during the 37-48 decade. The second book was Don Lavoie's superb 1985 work, Rivalry and Central Planning, the Socialist Calculation Debate Reconsidered. This was a book which explored the Misesian side of the socialist calculation debate, masterfully demonstrating how that position grows out of the Austrian rejection of purely equilibrium price theory, and that And that critique grows out of and reflects its emphasis on the dynamic, rivalrous, competitive forces which drive the market process. In this way, Lavoie was able to demolish the orthodox view that the Mises-Hayek arguments had been definitively refuted by their critics. This brief outline that we've just given of the central thesis of this talk urgently calls out for some elaboration. So let me try. Let me summarize what we'll try and set forth in the following propositions. Number one, the core understanding of how the market economy works, an understanding developed as a result of the marginalist revolution of the 1870s, was basically common to the various neoclassical schools which came to constitute much of the economics profession during the early decades of the 20th century, replacing the former dominance of the German historical school and of its intellectual offspring in the UK and the USA. Second, in this core understanding, the central thrust was the theory of competitive market process. Although attention was, in Walrasian and to some extent in Marshallian version of the common doctrine, certainly paid to equilibrium outcomes, but the market was not, in the early decades of the 20th century, seen as consisting primarily in its equilibrium state. Point number three, gradual refinements of neoclassical theory as the 20th century developed, and the growing sophistication and influence of Walrasian theory, together with a more careful Knightian articulation of what came to be seen as the conditions for perfect competition, and in addition, certain implications of Lionel Robbins' important definition of what the term economic means, all these developments came by the mid-30s to mean that for the cutting edge of mainstream economic theory at that time, the competitive market meant the fulfillment of the conditions for equilibrium. Fourth, this shift in focus, implicit in much of the work of the 30s, was at first simply not noticed by the Austrian economists. Thus, in his 1933 book, Grundprobleme der Nationalökonomie, which was later translated in 1960 as the epistemological problems of economics, Mises had no qualms in approvingly citing a statement which had been made by Oscar Morgenstern that the Austrian school, the Anglo-American school, and the school of Lausanne differ only in their mode of expressing the same fundamental idea, and that they are divided more by their terminology and by peculiarities of presentation than by the substance of their teaching. Now, Mises endorsed that in 1933. I can assure you that when I came to study under Mises in 1952, he would have denounced a statement like that. But in 1933, he had not noticed that the difference, the glaring difference, the gaping gulf separating the Austrian position from the mainstream. Number 5, so that when in the 1937-48 decade, Mises and Hayek found it necessary to clarify what their critique of socialism really meant, they believed themselves to be merely emphasizing the central meaning of commonly accepted neoclassical theory. They were simply not aware that their clarifications were, in fact, important original insights, significantly deepening our understanding of how markets work. There's an important book by Frank Mashovek, Perfect Competition and the Transformation of Economics, 1995 book, which explores this very theme. Point number 6. On the other hand, as the new equilibrium versions of neoclassical microeconomic theory came to dominate the mainstream, the textbooks dismissed these clarifications by Mises and Hayek not as important theoretical contributions, but as merely tired repetitions of early, less sophisticated incarnations of neoclassical theory. 7. All this accounts for the circumstance that for decades following the end of World War II, the textbooks unanimously and wrongly dismissed the Mises-Hayek critiques of socialism as having been decisively refuted by the writers who, starting from an exclusively equilibrium view of markets, had demonstrated how the equilibrium outcomes of markets might conceivably be duplicated by sophisticated central planners. Our position today will be that the arguments of Mises and Hayek, working within their market process framework, were entirely immune to such neoclassical equilibrium critiques. And moreover, that their clarifications of the meaning of dynamic competitive forces, as distinguished from the concept of perfect competition, and their clarifications of the entrepreneurial process driven by the urge to win pure profit, rather than the conditions in which pure profit is ruled out by definition, that these clarifications constituted major original contributions to a more sophisticated Austrian economics. Mises and Hayek, one surmises, saw their clarifications as no more than careful restatements of earlier widely recognized truths. We, with the hindsight of subsequent history of thought re-evaluation, can recognize the novelty and creativity of these contributions. It was only decades later, after years of Walrasian dominance, that the younger Austrians could recognize the yawning gulf separating these Mises-Hayek contributions from the mainstream orthodoxy, and could at the same time recognize the validity and importance of these contributions. In 1932, Lionel Robbins presented his celebrated definition of that which is economic. Robbins taught us that the economic perspective on human and social affairs focuses on that aspect of human activity, whether in isolation, Crusoe, or through interpersonal interaction, markets, on that aspect of activity in which each individual recognizes that he is seeking to maximize an outcome, utility, profit, is seeking to maximize an outcome in a situation circumscribed by given resource limitations. Scarce means, juxtaposed with multiple competing ends, impose the need to economize. In a market society, the scarce means with respect to which an individual must economize turn out to be definable only in terms of the opportunities being made available by others. Thus, a person's budget constraint is a function of the market prices of the items which he might be interested in buying. Robbins' emphasis on economics as a discipline based on seeing market participants as decision makers was a distinct advance over earlier British formulations. And this advance was, in fact, deeply influenced by his familiarity with the Austrian school in the late 1920s. Robbins had visited Vienna a number of times in the late 20s, and he had been deeply influenced by the Austrian school. So this was an advance for which Austrians could take credit. However, as the textbooks of the 30s and 40s came to incorporate Robbins' important insight into the meaning of efficient allocation of resources, they came to extend that insight to areas of economics to which Robbins had not directly referred. One of these extensions was roundly deplored by James Buchanan in his 1963 presidential address to the Southern Economic Association. And that extension was the direct application of the notion of individual economizing activity, that is, the seeking by the individual to maximize the satisfaction of his/her ends within a framework of given means, the extension of that notion to the economy as a whole. Somehow, the textbooks illegitimately cited Robbins as the source of the idea that a nation is confronted with a global problem of allocating its resources efficiently. A second extension of Robbins' insight was the acceptance of an assumption believed to be implicit in Robbins' formulation, namely that each individual in society does in fact correctly know the constraints governing his individual economic problem. It was not always borne in mind that this assumption, if consistently applied, this assumption is a coherent one, strictly and exclusively in an equilibrium market context. Only if a market were already in a state of general equilibrium could it be imagined that every individual is correctly aware of all relevant market prices. But clearly in a market not in equilibrium, current market prices are by no means given. They are in continual flux as a result of market movements during the storm of adjustments which mark the disequilibrium market. Now, both Hayek and Mises, although neither of them directly challenge the Robbinsian definition, but both Mises and Hayek separately grappled with these same issues. Mises, in his monumental 1949 Human Action, and in his earlier 1940 German language version, Nationalökonomie, Mises presented economics as concerned not with economizing decision-making, but with human action. To act, Mises pointed out, is to aim purposefully at a goal. While efficient allocation of given scarce resources may certainly, possibly be one form of human action, this latter term, the term human action, does not in any way depend upon assumed prior knowledge on the part of the actor concerning means and ends. Indeed, human action includes the very determination of the framework of ends and means with respect to which efficient resource allocation may hopefully be achieved. It should be noted that the notion of human action, unlike the notion of economizing, cannot even in principle be extended from the level of the individual to the level of an entire society, so that Mises' step beyond Robbins represents a further deepening of the subjectivist perspective which Robbins had himself absorbed from the Austrian economists whom he had met in Vienna during the late 20s. It was Mises' focus on human action which led him to recognize and to emphasize the role of pure entrepreneurship in individual action and in the dynamic market process. As he pointed out, although we ordinarily recognize entrepreneurship in the market context, the truth is that every human actor is, at the moment of action, an entrepreneur. He faces an open-ended future within which he must determine the range of opportunities available to him. The market process, driven by entrepreneurial pursuit of pure profit opportunities, consists in all of the interacting actions of all of the individual agents, all of them acting entrepreneurially. That is, acting with all the alertness that they can bring to bear in the respective situations in which they find themselves. Pure profit, the element which provides the dynamic force driving the market process, occurs when an alert, prescient entrepreneur senses that a complete package of inputs can be assembled today at a total cost which is below the revenue that will tomorrow be able to be received from eager consumers by producing and selling output without using anything more than what's in that package. In other words, pure profit emerges as the implication of what is in effect the presence of two market prices for the same package. The package can be assembled at a cost of 50, and the revenue from that package is 100. But this, by definition, is a disequilibrium situation. Two prices for the same package is a direct contradiction of the definition of equilibrium. What the market process consists of is an endless series of competitive entrepreneurial moves inspired by such arbitrage opportunities. All this is far, far removed from the Walrasian view of the market as a state of affairs in which all decisions being made are Robbinsian decisions, each of which correctly anticipates the parallel Robbinsian decisions being made by everyone else. This latter equilibrium situation offers no understanding of how it might ever be attained. Mises' articulation of the competitive entrepreneurial market process, an articulation which he apparently saw as merely the clarification of what all 20th century economists had once understood, was in truth a major, almost revolutionary advance in economic understanding. He presented this in his German language 1940 Nationaleconomie, and in 1949 in the English version of the same work, appropriately titled Human Action. Hayek's no less revolutionary contribution during this same decade came in the form of a series of remarkable papers, starting in 1937, continuing through 1945, and which were first published together in his 1948 Individualism and Economic Order. In these papers, Hayek underlined the role of interpersonal knowledge in markets. The very definition of equilibrium shows that such an imagined state is the state of complete, perfect interpersonal knowledge. Everybody knows every price in the market. Everybody knows every point on every thinkable demand curve and on every thinkable supply curve. And everybody knows that everybody else knows it. The market process, on the other hand, consists in the social process in which people come to know that which they have until now not known. The market process is a process of discovery and adjustment, creating the need for further discovery, etc., etc., etc. For both Mises and Hayek, the role of competition is drastically different from the role of perfect competition in mainstream microeconomics. The latter role, starting from its assumption of perfect knowledge, is that of ensuring that no disequilibrium elements are present in the theory of price. Paradoxically, this ensures that we have no theory of equilibration. For Mises and Hayek, on the other hand, competition means the dynamic forces which express the entrepreneurial discoveries which constitute the market process. The only requirement for a market to be competitive is that there be freedom of entry. That is, freedom for entrepreneurs to notice what they see as profit opportunities and to act upon their perceptions of available market opportunities. Were the defenders of socialist planning of the 1930s to have understood all this, they would have realized how irrelevant their solutions to Mises' challenge really were. But as noted, virtually the entire literature on the socialist calculation debate failed to grasp these revolutionary insights contributed by Mises and Hayek. It was this, we have argued, that explains both, first, why that literature for decades after World War II glibly repeated the myth that writers such as Langer and Lerner had successfully refuted Mises and Hayek on the socialist calculation issue, and second, why, failing to recognize the freshness and epic value of these new contributions by Mises and Hayek in the decade between 1937 and 1948, the mainstream literature read those years as marking the death of the Austrian school, rather than, as we have argued, as being one of the most fruitful decades in the history of the Austrian school. We can now place the doctrinal impact of Hayek's Nobel Prize into its more complete context. This more complete context concerns the places of both Mises and Hayek in the century-and-a-half history of the Austrian school. Many historians of thought have emphasized the undisputed differences between Hayek's economics and that of Mises. Our position here will be that in spite of real differences between Hayek and Mises, the doctrinal impact of Hayek's Nobel Prize underlines the commonalities shared by these two great Austrians. It may be helpful to the development of our position to cite here an oral remark once made by Hayek. It's published in the autobiographical dialogues that are published in Hayek on Hayek. This remark was to the effect that he had learned more from Mises than he had learned from anyone else. It's a remarkable statement. It's an oral statement, maybe off the cuff, but it was a statement that he learned more from Mises than he learned from anyone else. Now, I'm going to suggest what lies behind that statement. to grasp what I think is the meaning of this remarkable statement. After all, Hayek had never been a formal student of Mises. I believe that to grasp the meaning of this formal statement, the remarkable statement, it is useful to refer to another passage, an oft-quoted passage, which Hayek first wrote in 1942, and it was republished of part of his 1955 book on scientism in economics. In that passage, in his 1955 book, but originally in 1942, Hayek made the important claim that every important advance in economic theory during the previous century had been a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism. That's a remarkable statement. Every step, every important advance in economic theory during the preceding century was a further step in the consistent application of subjectivism. I suggest that this is what he learned from Mises. This is what he meant, that he learned more from Mises than he learned from anyone else. And there's a footnote to that passage in the 1955 book. In that footnote, Hayek adds, this development that is, the development of consistent application of subjectivism has probably been carried out most consistently by Ludwig von Mises. And that what may strike readers of Mises as being most strange and unacceptable is the result of the fact that in the consistent development of the subjectivist approach, he, meaning Mises, has for a long time moved ahead of his contemporaries. And I think on the basis of this, we can make a conjecture. What Hayek meant when he said he learned more from Mises than from anybody else. I think what he learned from Mises was his awareness of the open-endedness of the world. That is the fundamental subjectivist perspective. We live in an open-ended world, not in a closed-ended world. We live in an open-ended world. Standard economics treats the world as a closed universe, one in which relevant alternatives present themselves to decision makers in definitely perceived form. The decision maker sees himself as confronted by a limited number of clearly marked out possible courses of action, each leading to a definitely perceived outcome. In such a world, there is never surprise. A person can never be surprised. Everything, if a person doesn't know something, he knows that he doesn't know it. If a person doesn't know something, he knows what it costs to find out what he doesn't know. He's never surprised by a piece of information that he didn't know before, because he knew they didn't know it. So there's nothing to be surprised about. That's a closed-end world. But what Mises subjectivism taught Hayek was that we live in an open-ended world. That I believe, it requires us to reevaluate and restate the history, this long-run sweep of the development of the Austrian school. The history of economics, from its classical roots in the 18th century to its modern state at mid-20th century, was a story of transformation from a physicalist framework to a subjectivist framework. The classical economists saw causation in economics as being set in motion by the physical, natural constraints of niggardly nature. But modern economics understands that the pattern of economic outcomes is more fundamentally traceable to the actions of human beings in their roles of resource owners, potential consumers, and entrepreneurs. This understanding of the market process requires us to recognize that these decision makers, these resource owners, potential consumers, and entrepreneurs are aware that they are acting in an open-ended context. This understanding of the market process had been imbibed by Hayek through his exposure to Mises' ideas, both oral and written. So that when Hayek, in his developments of those remarkable essays that I've referred to between 1937 and 1945, in those essays, Hayek was developing that perspective, that subjectivist perspective, which he had fundamentally learned from Mises. And in this way, it's the contributions of Hayek and of Mises in that decade constitute as what I've called a radical deepening of subjectivist Austrian understanding. Certainly, these advances were separate advances. Hayek's emphasis on knowledge discovery is distinct from Mises' emphasis on entrepreneurial action. But taken together, these separate advances constituted a joint, highly important step forward in subjectivist understanding. This is what we have meant by seeing these advances as a joint, radically significant contribution to the refinement and increased sophistication of the central message of the Austrian school. So the argument in this paper is that the advance of subjectivist thinking in contemporary Austrian economics can be attributed, at least in part, to the Nobel Prize that was awarded to Friedrich Hayek in 1974. It was this award, we have suggested, that sparked the post-1974 rediscovery by younger Austrians of the radical contributions to the deepening of subjectivist economic understanding which had been made more than a quarter of a century earlier by Mises and Hayek. The vitality of the subsequent resurgence in Austrian economics may, we have proposed, be seen as an important step further in recognizing the scope and potential of subjectivism in economic analysis. As we look back on the 4 decades which have passed since Hayek's Nobel Prize, we can, in this way, appreciate the historical significance of this award for the ensuing, no longer mysterious rebirth of the Austrian school. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for questions. We have 2 microphones on the side. Raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. The microphones will go. When you get the microphone, please, state your name and affiliation and state your question clearly.
Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you so very much for your talk. I would ask you, is it possible to connect this open-endedness with either Frank Knight's comparison of risk and uncertainty and Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge as an effort to understand the world in a subjective and open-ended fashion?
Let me begin by referring to Polanyi. I think you're right on the Polanyi connection. On the Knight connection is more complex. Knight's important distinction between risk and uncertainty, in which uncertainty refers to an open-ended world. It's quite right. But Knight's view of the open-ended world was that it was a nuisance. The open-ended world is an embarrassment. The economics is based on that part which is not uncertain. He recognized he had a very sensitive understanding of how much of a nuisance the open-endedness could be. That's true. But he did not perceive that the market process was in fact a process that is generated by that open-endedness. I don't believe Knight saw that. That's, I think, the big difference between Mises Hayek on the one hand and Knight on the other.
Patrick.
Patrick Byrne, Overstock.com. Sometimes Hollywood gives Oscars lifetime achievement awards really for things people did decades ago, and they don't really anticipate anything new coming out. Is it your opinion that the Swedes gave the Nobel Prize to Hayek as some sort of lifetime achievement award for things but that they shared the orthodox view that he had sort of been eclipsed and was gone for good, or were they aware of the doctrinal advances that had been made while the rest of the world thought they had disappeared?
I don't believe they were fully aware of these advances. I think they were referring to Hayek's contributions in the earlier 30s, not in the decade from 1937 to 1945. In my view, as I see Hayek, each person sees Hayek, sees a writer from his own perspective. In my perspective, everything else sort of fades away. What's important are those papers that Hayek wrote between 1937 and 1945. But I believe that the award of the Nobel Prize was based on the other contributions of Hayek, particularly his macroeconomic contributions of the earlier 30s, his debate with Keynes and so on.
Mark Materno, Interactivity Foundation. I'm wondering if you could comment a bit about Mises' understanding of the a priori. You talked about some of the rejection of Mises being due to its embrace of an a priori methodology. And I'm wondering if you think of Mises as understanding the a priori more along Kantian lines, as implying certainty, strict universality. And I ask because I seem to think that there are passages in Human Action that suggest that he thought of a priori as not entailing certainty, as possibly being fallible knowledge as well.
Okay. There are several points that you've touched. I think you're right when Mises uses the adjective apodictic, right? Apodictic, having to do with, he wasn't talking about an open-ended logical system. He was talking about apodicticity, is that the word? Yeah. He was talking about an absolutely certain set of logic. Okay, I think that's correct. But that is not the same thing as what we were referring to when we talk about an open-ended world. Now, on the a priori, I'm not the philosophical expert to clarify Mises on a priorism. Let me make a general comment. Mises was much more than an economist, as Professor Betke mentioned earlier. Great economists are more than economists. Okay, Mises was a great philosopher. Mises had a system which went beyond pure economics. Although in Mises' own view, his economics was absolutely integrated with his philosophical system, I don't believe that's necessary. I don't believe it's necessary. I believe that the essence of Mises's contributions to pure economic understanding are independent of the philosophical framework within which he placed them. Okay? So that this is an excuse for my not being able and not really being so interested in justifying Mises' a priorism. Sometimes I think I understand what he meant. Many times I think I don't. But I always tell myself it doesn't matter. because Mises' economics, in my view, is independent of that philosophical system within which he framed it. Okay? Now that may be a violation of what Mises meant, but that's it.
And then Todd. Here and then Todd.
Eskil Olberg from George Mason University. Thank you for this great presentation. You become really curious to study this more. I have a question regarding the innovation. That the innovation, invention, and so on, this is something that everybody's thinking about today in policy, and they try to grapple with that. And you are sort of outlined the field of research, in a sense, by your story. So my question is, how would one go forward from here? And what kind of fields would be really useful for studying, in your sense, to better capture this uncertain, open-ended way, the wild life or world that he is looking at? Thank you.
Okay. See, an economic theorist is in a comfortable position. He sits at his desk, okay, and he doesn't have to act in the real world. He talks about people acting, okay, but he doesn't have to act, right? He simply has to understand what people are doing when they're acting, okay. What I mean by that is that it is one thing to recognize the entrepreneurial element, the innovative element, if you will, in human action, and its part in the market process is quite another thing to be able to give people advice. How can I be a successful entrepreneur? Okay? So I often point out, in fact, when I did receive that award that Pete mentioned earlier from the Swedish organization on entrepreneurship, I had to tell them, I think you're making a mistake. You're interested in entrepreneurship. I'm interested in the market process. You're interested in how can we educate business leaders to be successful entrepreneurs. I don't know anything about that. What I know is that the market process depends on those entrepreneurs. That's the Misesian insight. The Misesian insight does not in any way help us understand what kind of research can be used can be deployed to improve our entrepreneurial activities. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not in any way trying to downgrade the importance of research and advances in advising people how to be good entrepreneurs, how to innovate, and so on. But maybe it was Baumel or others said, if you can teach it, it ain't entrepreneurship. So I have some doubts about the usefulness of research into entrepreneurship, but I don't wish in any way to discourage it. I can understand that it's a very important line of activity, but I have my reservations about it.
Todd, and then anyone, and then we also have Mark in the back.
Thank you for your remarks. First, also thank you for calling attention specifically to Hayek's 37 paper, which I think is somewhat neglected and very, very important paper. And so I agree with you on that. One thing I'd be interested in your reflection on is obviously Hayek's Nobel lecture itself was quite controversial in terms of his observations on the economics profession. And in that vein, it's kind of impossible to imagine the American Economic Review publishing the use of knowledge in society today without any equations or anything else. I was just curious whether you have any reflections on Hayek's reflections at that time on economics today.
I think you're right. Hayek was deeply disappointed by the direction in which the economics profession had moved. I don't think he would be much comforted by what has happened since then. I think you're right. His brilliant papers between 1937 and 1945 would not find their way into the American Economic Review. I think you're right. The difference between what many economists are doing today, what the mainstream is doing today, is understanding the role of insight. Insight. The important economic contributions of the subjectivist tradition is insight. It's you see two people exchanging. One person puts down $5 and picks up a Sunday paper. Okay. You just see an exchange. Two objects are moving. Okay, the subjectivist insight is that the person who's putting down the $5 values the paper more than the $5. Where for an external observer, there's sort of an equivalence between the two. Insight shows us that there is an absolute disagreement on relative valuation. I'm just using that as an example of the notion of insight. And I believe that if you'll follow through the contributions of Mises and Hayek in the most subjectivist of their contributions, you will find that their contributions constitute insight, recognizing, and only a human mind can have insight into the actions of another individual. We can understand what an individual is doing because we have purposes too. We are purposeful individuals, and we can understand the purposefulness which moves another individual to action. Purpose is not something that can be observed empirically. That's where the subjectivism comes in.
Don, and then Mark.
Don Boudreaux, George Mason Economics. Israel, I wonder if you would, given your emphasis on open-endedness as a key feature of the Austrian tradition, I wonder if you would include someone who's not normally considered an Austrian, although a fellow traveler, as being more firmly in that tradition than most people think. I'm thinking of Julian Simon, the late Julian Simon, and his idea of the human mind being the ultimate resource. If that's not an open-ended, an understanding of the open-endedness, I don't know what is. And so I'm just curious of what your opinion of Julian Simon is. How much have you thought about him and his work fitting into this tradition?
I think that's a very, very pertinent observation. Julian Simon was an Austrian. He was an Austrian. There were many individuals who were trained in Vienna who were not Austrians. I remember I gave a talk once in Vienna in 1981, and I got them very angry. I said, I'm the only Austrian in the room. Julian Simon is an Austrian, okay? I had delightful contact with him. You don't have to be a student of Mises or Hayek to be an Austrian. You have to understand what subjectivism is. Labels don't matter. Julian Simon was, if you want to use the word, the label Austrian, he was an Austrian. You're absolutely right. I agree with you.
Mark.
Now, Mark Skousen, Chapman University. Israel, I'd like you to follow up with this. You briefly mentioned the issue of empiricism and the future of Austrian economics, if it can pursue an empiricist perspective, that it can engage in econometric modeling. Seems like Mises was opposed to that, but Hayek maybe, Friedman once said that he was influenced by being at Chicago, and particularly his Constitution for Liberty was affected by his being at Chicago, suggesting empiricism and testing of hypotheses and so forth. And I believe Hayek also was very supportive of the Economic Freedom Index, which is clearly an empirical work. And I might also add Julian Simon, that you label an Austrian, was also very much an empiricist. So my question to you is, to what extent can Austrian economics advance without doing empirical work? Is there some kind of empirical work that you would support in the tradition of Austrian economics?
Okay. I think it's a very pertinent question. Let me point out that there is economic theory and there is applied economic theory. Mises, Hayek were economic theorists, which does not mean to say that they were in any way antagonistic to applied economic theory. It's quite true that they did not themselves engage in empirical work. And it is quite true that Mises certainly was highly skeptical of much of the empirical work. But his skepticism of empirical work can be traced to his understanding, his correct understanding, that those who were engaged in that work thought themselves to be engaged in providing the foundation for economic theory. For example, Mises used to ridicule Schulz's theory of demand, his empirical demand curves. The demand curve for potatoes in Iowa in the September of 1927 makes no permanent contribution to knowledge. It may be very important. And I don't believe that Mises and Hayek would in any way discourage applied economic theory, but it's applied. And the economic theory itself is independent of the empirical work that constitutes applied economic theory. Now, nobody can predict the course of knowledge. It could be that pure theory that advances in pure theory have reached points of diminishing returns. in which case the immediate responsibility of Austrian economists would be to engage in applied Austrian theory. But there is such a thing as division of labor. Not every theorist can be challenged. Why didn't you do applied theory? The important point that I think needs to be emphasized is that empirical work has its definite place, may be a very valuable place, as history, as illustration, as rhetoric in order to draw attention to important problems, but it is to be sharply distinguished from pure theory, which is after all the main content of the history of Austrian economics since its beginning.
Russ Roberts?
Russ Roberts, Hoover Institution. Professor Kirzner, I want to thank you for your remarks, and I want to ask you to be my psychologist for a second. So, along with the number of people in this room, I consider myself to be deeply influenced by your open-ended way of describing Hayek and Mises' insights. If I had to identify myself, I would call myself an Austrian. I think the dynamic nature of the market process is the thing that motivates my understanding of the world around me more than anything else. Yet I am handicapped by my Chicago PhD. And along with other people in this room who I won't name, because it might embarrass them, we often find ourselves using what you would think, close-ended tools for thinking about the world, particularly supply and demand. So if you ask me, how do I organize my thinking about the world, I would say I use a mixture of open-ended Hayekian market process imposed over a supply and demand framework that I recognize is remarkably unrealistic, superficial, misses all the interesting things about what the actor's really doing, and assumes things like, I take the quality of the good constant, which of course is no entrepreneur does that in any thoughtful way. Help me out. Do I have a genetic disorder that I need to overcome? Do I need therapy to remove this close-ended part of my life? Or should I try to continue to schizophrenically live with them together?
I can respond in a soothing way. You're doing fine. You're absolutely right. An open-ended perspective on the world does not forbid one to use supply and demand analysis. Supply and demand analysis is enormously valuable. If I had to teach freshmen one class, it would be supply and demand, not Hayekian Misesian economics. I think that would be true. They would get more understanding in a crude sense of how the world works by focusing on its closed-ended elements. I think that's correct. But that doesn't mean to say we have to stop there. So I don't think there's any contradiction whatsoever. We do use supply and demand tools, the tools of the Marshallian supply and demand theory. And an honest Austrian at each point will say, but this is not true. Right? This is a useful fiction. It is a useful framework within which to simplify and understand what's going on. But it doesn't get to the fundamentals. And that's precisely, I believe, why early 20th century economics went astray. They took the valuable tools of supply and demand analysis and took that to be economics. And then, of course, you have to sophisticate it, right? One good world is sort of simple, right? So you got to have a multiple good world you have to expand your simple Marshallian supply and demand into a set of Walrasian simultaneous equations. Okay, that's where they went wrong. But there's nothing wrong whatsoever with recognizing the heuristic value of working with the crude Marshallian supply and demand analysis.
Frank Michovic, Wofford College.
Professor Kirzner, I've been thinking about the most recent Nobel Prizes, and I'll just categorize it loosely as the theories of rationality. And what does it mean to be rational, and emotionalism versus pure Cartesian rationality. And I was just wondering, have you had any thoughts about to what extent these new theories and new writings have been positive for our discipline, and to what extent they may have undermined principles that are very important to us and that we have to be ready to respond to? Have you had occasion to think about this yet?
I don't really have an answer to your question. I'm so impressed by the book that I quoted from you earlier. My lecture was an expansion on your book, as you will recognize. But I don't have an answer to your question. My understanding, my limited understanding of these contributions is that these are useful, interesting bits of analysis which don't get to the fundamentals of economic understanding. But that's not necessarily a criticism of it. But I'm not providing an answer to your question.
Brian Mercurio from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Faculty of Law. Thank you, Professor Kirzner, for the excellent talk and for being very candid in your responses. A very simple question, but one I'm struggling with when I'm reading modern Austrian authors. And it's to what extent, if any, intellectual property rights are consistent with the Austrian school of thought. So I was just wanting to know your views on that.
Property rights is a matter of law, matter of moral understanding, moral foundations, based on moral foundations. Austrian economics, or any economics, takes rights as given. Rights as given. And to the extent that rights are given, the economics itself has nothing to say about the appropriateness of intellectual property rights or not. Am I allowed to use a chalk on a blackboard? Excuse me, I grew up in the 19th century. Am I allowed to use chalk on a board without paying a royalty to the first person back thousands of years ago who found that if you take chalk, you daub it on the wall, you can make an interesting piece of graffiti, right? I don't know, but that's a moral question. As all property rights questions are. So I don't think that the framework of Austrian economics or any economics really can provide us with direct guidance on intellectual property rights. I'm always reminded by Mises' statements regarding patents. People used to ask him, are you in favor of patents? Isn't it a monopoly? Or is it a protection of private property rights? And Mises, this I think is the only time when Mises says, I don't know. It's the only time when Mises says, on the one hand and on the other hand. Okay? And I think that captures the answer to your question. On the one hand, on the other hand.
Some of the questions in the back. James? Jaime?
Hi, I'm Jaime Narbon, President of National Economists Club. Dr. Kirzner, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Mises and Hayek's earlier teachings on the business cycle and their application to today's economic discourse.
Briefly, the answer is no. Mises' contributions to business cycle theory began in 1912. Okay, he had a theory. It was a theory that was fully consistent with his economic framework, with his theoretical framework. Hayek subsequently built on that theory and developed his own business cycle theory. I don't think that too much of that theory depended in a crucial way on the degree of subjectivism that we've been talking about. So that's what I mean when I say I don't have the answer to the question. I just don't know to what extent one can attribute Hayek's development of the earlier Mises theory of the cycle to deepened subjectivist understanding. I don't believe that Hayek's subsequent work, which I've characterized as being a radical extension of subjectivism in Austrian economics, I don't believe that owed very much to his earlier work. I do remember Hayek used to say that in his off-the-cuff remarks to people, he would say that he is happy that, unlike other people who would stay on a problem all their life, he was able to move away from business cycle theory to other things, which I take it to mean that his subsequent work was, to some extent, indistinct from and separable from his work of business cycle. That's a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer to your question.
All right, please join me in thanking Dr. Kirzner.